On July 13, 2024, a political rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, became the scene of an assassination attempt that would shock the United States. Former President Donald Trump was speaking to a crowd when gunfire suddenly erupted. Trump was wounded in the ear. One rally attendee, Corey Comperatore, was killed while protecting members of his family, and two other people, David Dutch and James Copenhaver, were seriously wounded. The person responsible was a 20-year-old man from Pennsylvania named Thomas Matthew Crooks. Within minutes, Crooks was dead, the attack was over, and one of the most important questions remained unanswered. Why did he do it? FBI identified Crooks the following day and opened a major investigation. But investigators faced an unusual problem. The evidence could establish what Crooks had done, but finding a clear reason for why he had done it proved much harder. Thomas Matthew Crooks was born in 2003 and lived in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, a suburb south of Pittsburgh. He was not a famous political activist, he was not a known terrorist, and according to the FBI, he was not previously known to the Bureau. That made the events of July 13 even more difficult to understand. Crooks had apparently lived an ordinary life. He attended school. He graduated from Bethel Park High School in 2022. He later attended classes at the Community College of Allegheny County. People who knew him described a young man who did not appear to fit the image many people expected of someone capable of carrying out an attack on a presidential candidate. But appearances can hide things. And during the months before July 13, investigators discovered that Crooks had been researching political events, and eventually the Butler rally. The investigation would later uncover searches connected to both Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. In late September 2023, an account linked to Crooks' search for Trump's campaign schedule. Then in the months leading up to the rally, his online searches became increasingly focused on political events in western Pennsylvania. On July 4, he searched for details about Trump's upcoming appearance in Butler. 2 days later, he registered to attend the rally. He also searched for information about the location and where Trump would be speaking. Investigators later found searches about the Butler Farm show site and photographs of the area. One search compared the distance between a potential shooter and President John F. Kennedy. Another looked up information about the rally's podium. These details became important because they suggested that the Butler event was not something Crooks simply encountered by accident. He had been looking into it, but knowing that someone researched an event does not automatically explain why. And that distinction became one of the central problems in the investigation. The FBI examined his electronic devices. Agents searched his home and vehicle. They interviewed witnesses and law enforcement officers. They reviewed photographs and videos from the rally. The goal was to reconstruct his movements and understand what had happened before the shooting. But the more investigators learned, the more complicated the mystery became. There was no simple manifesto explaining everything. There was no publicly confirmed message that neatly answered the question. And the FBI said it had not identified a definitive motive. That meant the public was left with a disturbing gap. The evidence showed preparation. It showed research. It showed that Crooks had been interested in the rally, but it did not provide a complete explanation for what was happening inside his mind. On the afternoon of July 13, people began arriving at the Butler Farm show grounds. The event was part of Trump's 2024 presidential campaign. Supporters gathered to hear him speak. The atmosphere was typical of a major political rally. People waited for the candidate. Security personnel worked around the site. And thousands of people watched the stage. Crooks was among the people in the area, but he was not supposed to become the most important person at the rally. He was not a politician, he was not a speaker, he was simply one person in a huge crowd. Then the situation changed. Crooks moved onto the roof of a nearby building. From there, he had a view toward the area where Trump was speaking. People at the rally noticed something was wrong. Some witnesses attempted to alert law enforcement. But the warning came too late. At approximately 6:11 p.m., gunfire began. Trump had been speaking when the shots were fired. The former president suddenly moved and touched his ear. Secret Service agents immediately surrounded him. The crowd reacted in confusion. Some people dropped to the ground. Others began moving away. Security officers rushed toward the source of the gunfire. The attack lasted only moments. But those moments changed the lives of everyone at the rally. Trump was wounded. Corey Comperatore was killed. David Dutch and James Copenhaver were seriously wounded. And Crooks was killed by a Secret Service counter-sniper. The attack was over almost as quickly as it had begun, but the investigation was just beginning. The FBI took the lead in examining Crooks and the events surrounding the attack. Investigators began collecting evidence from the scene. They examined his phone and other electronic devices. They searched locations connected to him. They interviewed people who had seen him before and during the rally, and they began reconstructing his movements. The FBI later said it had conducted hundreds of interviews and analyzed large amounts of video footage. The investigation was not simply about identifying the shooter. Everyone already knew who he was. The harder question was whether Crooks had acted completely alone. Was there someone else involved? Had anyone helped him? Had anyone known what he was planning? And most importantly, what had motivated him? Investigators eventually reported that they had not found credible evidence that Crooks had conspired with someone else. They also said they had not found evidence that a foreign government or foreign entity had directed him. But the motive remained unclear. That uncertainty led to intense speculation. Almost immediately, theories spread across the internet. Some people claimed Crooks belonged to one political movement. Others claimed he belonged to the opposite side. Some claimed he had been secretly controlled by another organization. Others suggested that the attack was part of a larger conspiracy, but investigators did not find evidence supporting those claims. The real story was more complicated. Crooks appeared to have researched politics. He had researched Trump. He had researched the rally. But his exact political beliefs and the reason he decided to attack remained difficult to establish. That is an important distinction. A person's internet searches can show what they were interested in. They do not automatically tell us everything they believed, and in Crooks' case, the FBI was careful not to claim a motive that the evidence could not prove. There were also questions about his behavior in the days immediately before the attack. Investigators found that he had continued researching political events. He searched for information about the Republican National Convention and the Democratic National Convention. He also looked up information about the Butler rally. By July 6, the event had become a specific target of his research. On July 9, he searched for a ballistic calculator. On July 10, he searched for weather information in Butler. On July 12, the day before the rally, his activity continued. These details showed that the attack did not appear to be a completely spontaneous act. There had been preparation. But preparation and motive are not the same thing. That is what made the case so difficult. Investigators could build a timeline. They could determine where Crooks went. They could examine what he searched for. They could identify the physical evidence, but they could not simply open his mind and discover the one reason that caused him to make his decision. And because Crooks died at the scene, there would be no trial, there would be no courtroom questioning, there would be no opportunity for prosecutors to ask him why, there would be no cross-examination. The person who knew the answer was dead. The assassination attempt also raised serious questions about security. How had a 20-year-old been able to reach a position from which he could fire toward a former president? Why was the building not secured before the attack? Why did warnings from people at the scene not stop the attack sooner? Those questions were separate from the FBI's investigation into Crooks himself. The FBI made clear that its primary responsibility was to investigate the shooter's actions and determine his motive and whether anyone else had been involved. Other investigations examined the security failures surrounding the rally. Those reviews became a major part of the aftermath. The attack also changed the political atmosphere in the United States. Trump survived and continued his campaign. The shooting immediately became one of the defining moments of the 2024 presidential election. Images of Trump being surrounded by Secret Service agents spread around the world. The attack became part of American political history. But behind the famous photographs was a much more disturbing story. A young man had spent months researching political events. He had eventually focused on one specific rally. He traveled to Butler. He reached a nearby rooftop. And within minutes, a political event had turned into a deadly attack. The investigation revealed pieces of his preparation, but never produced a simple explanation for why he chose to do it. That is what separates this case from many famous assassination attempts in history. In some cases, the motive is obvious. The attacker leaves behind a statement. A political organization claims responsibility. A manifesto explains the reasoning, or the person survives long enough to explain what happened. Here, none of those things gave investigators a complete answer. Crooks left behind evidence, but evidence is not the same as an explanation. The FBI continued examining his digital history and interviewing people who knew him. Investigators looked at his online activity going back several years. They tried to understand his interests, his behavior, and his plans. They also investigated whether there had been any co-conspirators. According to the FBI, no credible evidence was found that someone else had planned the attack with him, and no evidence was found showing that a foreign entity had directed him. The picture that emerged was of a young man who had apparently acted on his own, but the precise motive remained unknown. That may be the most unsettling part of the entire story. We know his name, we know his age, we know where he lived, we know that he researched the rally, we know that he attended the event, we know that he carried out the attack, we know that Trump survived, we know that one spectator was killed and 2 others were seriously wounded, we know that Crooks was killed at the scene. But we still cannot reduce the entire event to one simple sentence explaining why he made the decision. History often gives us the beginning and the end of a story. The difficult part is understanding what happened in between. Thomas Matthew Crooks became a name known around the world in a matter of minutes. Before July 13, 2024, almost nobody outside his community knew who he was. After that afternoon, his name became permanently connected to one of the most serious political attacks in modern American history. But the fame did not explain him. It only made the unanswered questions bigger. Who was he becoming before the attack? What was he looking for when he researched political events? Why did the Butler rally become the focus of his attention? And when did curiosity turn into preparation? Those are the questions investigators tried to answer. Some received partial answers, others did not. And perhaps the final lesson of the case is that knowing what someone did does not always tell us why they did it. On July 13, 2024, Thomas Matthew Crooks arrived at a political rally. Minutes later, he attempted to assassinate a former president. Trump survived. One innocent man lost his life, 2 others were seriously wounded, and Crooks himself never left the scene alive. The FBI spent months examining his life, his devices, his searches, his movements, and his contacts. Yet the central mystery remained. The evidence could reconstruct much of the attack, could show what happened, but it could not provide the complete answer to why. And that unanswered question remains at the center of one of the most shocking political attacks in recent American history.